Everyone. So the Writing Studio has started this new initiative of Writers at Work, and we bring wonderful novelists, writers to come and talk to us about their craft and also about their life, their process, and anything in between. And I'm so happy to have Saikat Majumdar this time. Saikat is a professor of English and creative writing at Ashoka University. And what I like about Saikat is that he is not just a writer and he's not just an English professor, but he also has a lot of things to say about the universities and teaching and pedagogy of what's happening in India, especially in his column that he writes for the Outlook, which I read quite regularly. I always am keen to hear about somebody who's in academia, has a very fine sense of, a fine literary sense. And I look at him as a multidisciplinary academician who has a lot of interesting ideas about how colleges should be, how we should teach, and how students should be, how we should learn. And he's also a fantastic novelist. So this is his third novel, and he's also a literary critic. And I'm sure he's a fantastic professor, and I wish I could be in one of his classes. But I'm hoping that this will be one of those experiences where he's going to teach a lot of things to me. So I welcome you today, and I don't want to take up too much time. And today, Swati Joshi, our very own Swati, is going to be talking to him. She's our PhD student in the HSS department. So Swati, the floor is yours.
Very, very kind introduction. I hope I can live up to that. And it's really a delight to be here. So thank you.
To begin with saying a few words about the middle finger before I start discussing that with you. So.
Absolutely.
First of all, congratulations. Congratulations for the launch of the book. The book is amazing, and it's got an intriguing cover. And Saikat, the floor is yours to talk about the book. I think you'll be able to talk a bit more about this book than me.
Oh, no. I mean, I wasn't going to say anything as such, but thank you, Swati, for having me. And I'm especially grateful for this amazing reading of my novels that I've seen. I've learned new things about my own writing from your reading, especially of The Firebird. And I never thought that my novels would lend themselves to medical humanities perspective. But I think your very capacious description of medical humanities, the idea of vulnerable care, has really opened new dimensions. So thank you for this amazing, I mean, as Barth and Derrida used to say, that a really good reading is an extension of the work. You have kind of recreated the books. So I'm really delighted to be in conversation with you. I don't know if I should talk about the middle finger before I hear you, because I know it's still new. And I don't know how many people have finished reading it, and you're one of them. But I would love to hear you. But just since you put me on the spot, all I want to say is that I was actually quite nervous about this book, because this book, as Swati would know, and any of you who read my other work would know, it's a very departure in a very new direction. For the first time while writing a novel, I felt I kind of know how the story is going to turn out. And that is never the case with me. When I start novels, I start with an intense sense of a setting and atmosphere are very important to me. Characters, the story I really don't care about so much. The story kind of unfolds. And I think, once you imagine a character and you've written a little bit, they kind of go out of control and behave in their own way. And that's when you know it's working. Your failure, your lack of control over your characters is the mark of your success. I've realized that. Whereas for this novel, I kind of knew, and that's partly because it started as a kind of a contemporary rewriting of a myth. I was obviously, as many of us here, especially in college settings, was taken by the Drona Ekalavya story. And I wanted to imagine for a long time, what would that story look like in a contemporary college campus setting? What if there was a Drona? What if there was an Arjuna? What if there is an Ekalavya? What if there are some other characters what choices. And I think given the reality we are inhabiting in the education world, whether in the West or in India, a question of access to education, who has the right to knowledge, who has the right to a teacher, who gets the privilege, who doesn't. In a way, I see the constant replayment of the Ekalavya, Drona, Arjun story all over again in college campuses worldwide. And I wanted to write a version of that. So what that meant was I kind of went in knowing who the characters are and how they things will turn out. But again, as I started writing, I realized that I am obviously not a mythical writer in the sense, some of the wonderful myth exposers like Devdutt Patnaik or Chitra Banerjee Devkarni. I'm quite different from them because I'm much more interested in contemporary reality. I'm much more interested in the reality around. So the myth ends up being a far more distant echo. And I guess what ended up happening is I let the characters take their lives. And there was another myth that was also in my mind that was from Plato's Symposium, where Socrates is joking about or sleeping down next to my students. So obviously that very explosive subject of erotic connection, as a means of learning. And that's also a subject which I think has been around for so long, from Plato, Socrates, bell hooks, feminist writers like Jane Gallup. And finally, of course, the Me Too controversy about, what does it mean? What are the limits of intimacy and ethics when it comes to teachers and students? So there was that story. And I was also imagining something like a Drona who gets drawn to an Ekalavya, who gets attracted to an Ekalavya. So there were these conflicting myths. And in the end, I realized that even though I started that way, I have let the characters take over the story. The characters behave the way they wanted to, and then they reach their own conclusion. But I think in that sense, I'd say it is very different from my previous fictions, which were first of all, they were often about younger protagonists. I love the perspective of the child or the adolescent, the confusion, the fear, the terror. I love that. Whereas here, the protagonists are older, they're confident, they're a lot like you and me, people in the room. And so all of that reasons, and it was a far more cosmopolitan novel. It's set partly in the US, partly in Delhi, partly in other places, but always in around college campuses. So I think in some ways it was a new departure, mostly because of the mythical impulse, the idea of looking into the teacher-student relationship through the lens of myth. But as I said, in the end, I think my writerly character still took over and did not let me just realize a kind of a version of a myth, but let the character speak for yourself. But then you can say, since you've read it, it's for you to decide how much of that has come across and how much. I sometimes feel like by talking about the myth, I'm influencing the reader too much, because by reading the novel, I don't think they will necessarily get a sense of that, barring the epigraphs. But I'd love to know what you think.
No, I totally agree with you that your characters, I do not ever find any character as a minor character. Each character, I believe, in all of your works that I have read, have a voice, have an agency, which is very difficult to achieve as a writer. That's what I feel. But going back to the idea of vulnerable care that the two of us have been discussing for so long, you know, I have figured out that apparently there is a child protagonist in the middle finger as well, if you see. Um, so I have figured out somewhere a pattern, maybe, of vulnerable care between a mother and a child. So in The Firebird, you see Garima, as a mother, provides vulnerable care to her son. She's a theater actress. She travels from place to place to give fantastic performances. But in that process, somehow, she gives vulnerable care to her son, which is very difficult for a child to grasp. And the same kind of vulnerable care is received by the collection of poetry as well. So Megha treats her collection of poetry as, a child. And those are the passages that I literally find in, the middle finger. And I see that, Megha literally says that I feel like a parent to this collection of poetry. And it is then when the collection of poetry becomes a child, the co-protagonist. and Megha becomes the protagonist there. Megha takes her collection of poetry everywhere. I could see the similarity between the two, wherein Garima literally protests, or he should not perform on stage. Megha doesn't like her poems to be performed on stage or on YouTube. So there is a sort of, vulnerable care relationship, parent-child relationship. Only this time it's translated between the writer and their writing. So I would like to know your thoughts about that.
Right, right, absolutely. I think there's a part where she says something like dissertation is like a child, you put it away, and then it's like all dissertation writers out there in the room. I hope that is not unnerving. That if you're writing a dissertation and when you put it away, you kind of, whether you hate your old writing or you kind of come back. But no, I think you've touched on very key points as usual. I think many of my novels have writing as a theme. So even in my very first novel, Silverfish, about which I feel quite mixed, quite lukewarm, they were the writer. Firebird, of course, is the novel through which I felt I really found my voice. And both in Firebird and The Middle Finger, certain other forms of writing, in the Firebird theater and in the Middle Finger poetry. And I think I just said this in another interview recently, that because I primarily write prose, I only write prose. And as a prose writer, I feel in some ways empowered, but in some ways also limited, because we are read. We are not performed in that sense. I don't perform. There isn't a performative aspect. It's also a very lonely kind of a work. If you're writing novels, if you're reading novels, it's kind of more limiting. Whereas poetry has that physical aspect. You can perform poetry. Drama, of course, is already communal. And so I think there's a kind of a romance in me about genres that can be performed. I really admire singers. I really admire people who act, especially theater, also film, but especially theater. And of course, poets who perform. Poetry is, of course, both literary and performative. Poetry can be read as well as performed. Plays can also be read, but of course, someone like Shakespeare didn't really care his plays to be read. He really wanted it to be performed and sort of just. So I find that very powerful, because in many ways, this culture of reading and writing, which we all share, is a very modern culture. It goes back to the printing press. It goes back to the European Enlightenment. It goes back to only about 200 years. Whereas the culture of performance is far older. There's something almost primitive about it. Like theater goes back to forms of harvest rituals, agricultural rhythms, a lot of religious rhythms. Poetry goes back to. So I feel, when I look at these performative forms, I feel the sense of ancient power. And in the same way, who knows, we are kind of moving through a real crisis of print, with the decline in readership. The question is whether it's changing, whether it's going through a crisis. But of course, performance is taking on different digital avatars. So this is a subject I think a lot about. And I think in the Middle Finger, this becomes, because obviously in the Firebird, this is the personal bit that I mean, even though the story is made up, my own mother was an actress, and I have these memories of being a small child and really watching her on stage and feeling terrified that she's going to die when she's dying in a story, or watching her in a green room in a makeup where she's half dressed, and I'm like, is this really my mother? She looks familiar, and yet she looks so distant. So there is that powerful personal association I have with theater, because I never acted. And I said I always become a kind of a prose person, but I have this sense, even when I'm watching a play, I have very primal memories. I have very primal, something in me just sort of becomes alert. With Megha, I think she is a poet who writes, and yet, because her poems are performed, because she writes poems about race, she's living in the US and she's writing very politically charged poems about race. When they're performed, I think something happens, because when poetry of race or poetry of caste, maybe in India, or poetry of oppression, when it's performed, it takes on a very visceral and disturbing reality. And for Megha, there's always the question of authenticity, because she's a brown person in the US with some privileges. She's been to a good college, good university, and yet her experiences are not quite that of a, black person living in a in a ghetto. So there are this, and any brown person who's lived in the West knows this, that your experiences are that of a minority and yet not quite that of a black person. So she's constantly negotiating the reality of her privilege and the reality of our marginalization. And sometimes, when you hear your own words spoken out, you get a physical reaction. I think any writer, even if you were to read out, a couple of sentences from my novel, I will react in a good or a bad way, but something will happen to my body. And I think when it's a poem, it's even more powerful because poetry is so performative. And I think for Megha, when she sees her poems performed in a bars, in a pub, on Instagram, she reacts. She has this kind of reaction. So I think it's a very difficult, I think underlying through it is the whole relationship, whether art comes from the mind or art comes from the body. I think modern education has really pushed the body out. We really think of everything as intellectual and everything as mental. We live in a culture where to be mentally smart is better than be physically. But I think art is so much about the body. And this is something I've realized as I've written more. When you start writing, you think like, oh, I'm just going to be really clever and impress everybody with all the things I can do with language. And then I think especially with Firebird, because it touched such a primal part of myself, I realized one writes a sentence not just with their mind, but one writes a sentence with their entire body, you know, that visceral thing. And I think that's what Megha is dealing with, that her body is also in her poetry, and her body gets another level of bodiness when it's performed. And it comes with all kinds of vindictive, all kinds of vindication, as well as all sense of guilt, that, oh, did I have the right to say this? Sometimes when you write something, it sounds tame on paper, but when it's read out, wow, like, wow, how did I write that? That was amazing, or that was terrible. It just becomes intense. The intensity of that is very much. So I think she's dealing with all these feelings, and it's a, I don't know, the the simile between writing and children is a problematic one, but I think it's valid in some ways. But she's obviously has a very much a intense love-hate relationship with her own writing. So you're right.
I totally agree with you. There is a weird, love-hate relationship that every writer, no matter whether it's critical, whether it's creative, whatever writing one is writing, uh, I can feel it in my own process. The first draft that I write, I hate it the moment I write. And even if it's the third or the fourth draft, I don't think even if it were to get finalized, I would be happy as a writer. So I think that sort of, I can keep on improving, that sort of love-hate relationship that someone else might like. There are some sentences that I might like, but then that gap always remains. And
Right. And I think there's no difference. I don't believe in the difference between creative and critical writing, because critical writing, if it's about human phenomenon, unless you're writing about a scientific phenomenon, then it's different. But even scientific phenomenon interacts with human phenomenon. But anything you're writing about a human phenomenon, I think you are just being imaginative, because it's just a question of there's no perfection. The difference is, I think in some ways the writing that we call creative somehow again invokes the whole body. I think sometimes when we read an academic paper, it is very much a rational exercise, an intellectual exercise. But I think a poem or a novel transports us to a physical place. We can smell something, we can touch things. But a lot of good critical writing also does that. It has a personal opening. So I think I don't think what you're doing is any different. It's just a difference in genre. Personally, for me, I find it far more, admirable that people write both prose and verse. Since I don't write verse, except a little bit I dabbled for this novel. I think that's a bigger generic difference than writing prose of different kinds, criticism and fiction. They are much, for me, they are actually similar.
but I would not second you there. You're a wonderful poet, because this writing, trust me, I have never seen. I mean, I have dabbled very little than you. I'm a rookie, and when it comes to you, I'm learning a lot from you. In fact, that's what I said, that my short story that is about to be published owes its existence to the Firebird, because hadn't it been for Firebird, hadn't it been for Silverfish, this especially Firebird, gyrations wouldn't have been born. So yes, that is true. But yes, middle finger, I will not agree with you. You are a wonderful poet there, because I have picked out beautiful poetic lines, and especially when you were talking about giving body to the artwork through performance. I could also see somewhere that, even while describing poetry, or describing the process of poetry, uh, Megha's poetry has body itself, because there are statements like, fatal poetry, especially the ending. And I love the ending because Megha sees the map of fatal illness on the floor when she sees the marks of acid, when she goes to meet Poonam. And I could see how the parallels between how anatomy of poetry, the body of poetry, the map of poetry in Megha's collection that she sees, that she composes herself, and the map of acid, fatal illness that she sees on the floor. There's always a connection between poetry as a disease. This is what, somewhere the middle finger gives the hint of. There are beautiful lines about poetry as a contagion, poetry as an infection, and poetry is fatal, the fatal words that somehow scar Megha, but also care for Megha. So it's the kind of poetry that scares and cares. And when she sees this map of acid, the fatal map of acid, I could see how, the mapping between her mind that is there and the mapping that she creates in her poetry. So I was just thinking about how the body of the poetry is formed. How challenging was it for you as a writer to give body to poetry within a novel?
Right. No, I love the way, again, as you've read I mean, of course, a fantastically diseased mind is what Swati has. So clearly, I love the way you turn everything into disease. That is medical humanities. But yes, you're absolutely right. I think I told you that there is that whole disease metaphor. And those are the, small things about writing a novel during the pandemic. I think obviously the pandemic hasn't left much of a mark, but I think that passage is I think pandemic has made me think a lot about who is thought of as carriers of the disease. And of course, as we know that initially it was given a communal color for what kind of religious gatherings are spreading it, and then again later the class dimension was very interesting, because it was clear that it's more the middle and upper class who travel brought it. But then again, the whole question of domestic labor, and I think it was played out in a very, very fascinating way, and in what ways urban-rural divide. So I think in some ways that passage I wrote reflects a kind of a racial awareness around disease, right? And of course, there is that whole sort of touch on the plague and the Jewish race. The Jewish race is seen as careers of disease. So again, that's where it's a very biblical invocation. So that definitely came from that. I think one other very powerful formative force in the poetry here was religion. And I think this is something that has also occupied me since my last novel, The Scent of God. Again, as a person I'm not a believer myself, I'm not a religious person, and yet I love religion. I'm fascinated by religion. That's because I think so much of art, poetry, music would not be possible without religion. I mean, we do live in a world where religion is really abused, very unfortunately, and it's turned into something very dangerous, but that doesn't take away from the beauty of religion. um, and of course, in The Scent of God, it was as you know, it was Hindu monastic boarding school, and two boys falling in love with each other, and the relationship of sexuality and religion. Here it was the church sermon. So the church sermon for me, and often when we call ourselves secular, we call ourselves not religious, I realize that it's still a very liberal bourgeois position. We can afford to call ourselves secular because we have a certain kind of an education. We know science. We have access to technology. So we are not fatalistic, we can say. But the moment you even talk to maybe a domestic help who is from a village, and if they fall ill, you'll see that often they might go to a local government more than they go to a doctor, and you may deplore it, but the fact is there's a direct connection between faith and poverty. So the poor and the marginal everywhere, all over the world, whether it's indigenous populations or poor people here or African American churches in the US, everywhere there's a real connection between religion and sort of marginal position. So I've always thought, and this was a real problem, of course, with historians, that how does one give historical voice to, say, a tribal person without reflecting their religious belief? But history is a rational discipline; it can't make room for religion. So for me, for some reason, I imagine this person as being a devout Christian, and of course she's imagined as tribal also, though that's not explicitly said in the book. And her poetic inspiration is inseparable from her desire to speak in the church. So she wants to speak in the church like a sermon. And as I said, I love religious institutions. I love religious places. So I go to a lot of churches. I've been to a lot of churches in both in the US, Canada, and in India. And I really love the church service, and some of the most memorable poetry I've heard is actually in the church service. And there are so many kinds of churches. There are very orthodox churches, and there are extremely liberal churches like Unitarian churches, where I've seen, same-sex marriages and all kinds of things. So, what I wanted was that the power of religion, the power of faith, to create a certain kind of poetry. And that is a kind of a power which is not available to the urban secular person, because it comes from a power. And if you remember, I don't want to give out too much of the story, or for that matter talk over the novel for people who haven't read it, but there's a part where Megha does tell Jishnu that is a power you and I don't have, because that power comes from faith. But power comes from an act of self-negation, to believe that you are nothing. You are nothing before this all-powerful God, and that you cannot think like that if you are a secular person. And so in some ways, I think, in both these two novels, I think the power of art as rooted in religion. And when I say power, I don't just mean a positive power. It's just raw power. It can be positive, it can be extremely destructive. It depends on how you use it. But that power is what we see. That passion, that belief is what we see in the form of poetry. And I think church sermons historically are among the most poetic, and so many sermons all over I've heard, as well as, passages in the Bible. And I wanted some of that. And I think in that speech by Poonam's voice is very hard to capture, because she's, it's easier for me to write as a woman who shares more of my life spaces, but a woman like Poonam is so different. So her utterances are often poetic, and that poetic utterances is very much inflected by faith. So I don't know how successful I have been, but that was my goal there, to give a sense of the power of art and religion coming together.
Definitely, you have done great justice to this, I must say. And the beauty of poetry, that's where I could see, coming from not just, the service aspect of it, but, little things that we miss out and take for granted. And this is something that I have seen predominating your novels throughout. The sense of, olfaction, olfactory and proprioceptive senses have sort of dominated your work. And this beautiful, sort of marriage of senses in the novels is rare to find, wherein you see, the movement of the wrist and the sense of the, fragrance or the odors. So the content of the poetry is where, it's important, the way the wrist moves to write the poetry, depending on the odors that Megha can remember. The same I could see with, your previous novels as well, The Firebird. And this is what has, brought me to think about how sort of important, or how does a writer decide about portraying senses that are difficult to portray in terms of words. Something like olfactory senses very difficult, and it's everywhere. I mean, whatever discipline that we study, whether it's post-colonial studies, whether it's, the sense of olfaction is given very little importance, especially in research. So I was just wondering how, challenging, or how, adventurous rather, it was for you as a writer to highlight this sense of olfaction in all your novels when it comes to odors.
Right, right. No, I think the sensory is extremely important to me. I mean, I don't think anybody who grows up in an Indian city, or probably even an Indian, smaller town or even village, anywhere in India. I mean, it's a tropical country. Smells are everywhere. I don't think it's a undeniable part of your growing up. I think I heard some was it an American or a British literary agency, something like, oh, African writers are very visual. They talk about sights a lot. Indian writers, on the other hand, are very olfactory. Their primary senses, I mean, of course, they are also visual, and African writers can also, but if you really look at a lot of African writing, fiction and poetry, it's visual appeal, whereas Indian writers are always about, I mean, I'm not talking of the typical smell of ripe mangoes kind of a thing. That's the old kind of cliched, it's sort of a thing, or sort of this Raj novels and the heated, afternoons. But I'm talking about the variety of the messy maelstrom of smells that exist in a, you know, um, Indian neighborhood. I mean, I think, for instance, the idea of privacy, you can be, you don't need to really talk to your neighbors to know what they're cooking. Their cooking will come, if you live in a city where the houses are close to each other, immediately what is being cooked, and that kind of I grew up in a neighborhood like that in Calcutta, where that sense of, that para, that thing is always around, and noises. Arvind Krishna Mehrotra's Book of Indianness has this wonderful essay on the street callers of Calcutta. I think how from the morning, what different kinds of hawkers pass by, like what are they selling? It's fascinating, So this noises, I mean, how can one not? I have always been drawn by, I mean, whenever people ask me, what do you think of first, plot, character? I always say atmosphere. For me, it's always atmosphere which creates the possibility of a novel. And like in the Firebird, it was the atmosphere of theater, like the sort of maddening place, like not just the theater stage, but the green room, the wings, the darkness from you watch the play, or for that matter, that neighborhood where there's a kind of a gossip around the character of the female actor. Oh, is she really an actress? Is she a prostitute? That kind of scandalous interest where people are sitting in tea shops and worrying about the moral fiber. So that whole space, and in the Scent of God, it was, of course, this monastic boarding school where you smell saffron, and then there's hymns and flowers. There's the smell of purity, and in the smell of purity, there are adolescent bodies which are sort of discovering hormones. They're discovering puberty. So right in the middle of a prayer hall, when you're singing, your body is touching another boy's, and so the maddening mix of sexual stirring in a very austere atmosphere. And I felt that one had to be written about, because it this is the sensory nature of Hinduism also. The sexuality is so inseparable from the religion. So for me, it's always atmosphere. In that sense, I think the middle finger was less atmospheric in its origin. As I said, it came most from this idea of the myth. But again, in the actual writing, I think I had to be the atmospheric writer that I am. I mean, that whole story, the idea of, I did hear of a story of a vegetarian person who used to live inside a market, and she lived inside a market. And there were these shanties, and right under her house, or that slum, was a chicken butchering shop. And imagine if you're a vegetarian person and you're living all day and night, and chicken is being slaughtered right under you. And that really shook me. I mean, as somebody I'm not a vegetarian, I eat chicken, everything. But even then, the whole idea of living like that, that space. And again, as you know, the idea of meat eating and vegetarianism has occupied me again. In The Scent of God, there's a passage about eating beef and, there's that. So this, obviously, I think right now in this country, it's impossible. And I'm sure you're in Gandhinagar, you're very aware of these debates. This is a very sensitive subject. So I think in different ways. And that atmosphere had to be captured. And again, the idea of certain kind of alcohol being so destructive for you, country made hooch, which falls on the floor and makes an acid stain. So there are these sensory details and the smell. I mean, the whole idea of when you let a chicken out from that kind of a cage, the chicken doesn't move because it's sort of dazed. It's just accepted its death. And what does it mean to live like that? What does it mean to live in that atmosphere? And again, I have walked through, anybody here has been through an Indian market, knows the atmosphere is so incredibly sensory. I mean, it can be in some ways very gross. It can be very attractive depending on what food you like and what you don't like. It can be anything, but it's again maddening. I mean, the way people shout this, and especially if you go to a market at night. I mean, I'm just fascinated by that. Sometimes I walk into a market at night, those closed markets and those little yellow bulbs hanging, and people bargaining, and then I mean, whether animals being slaughtered to sort of, it's just, and to have, so those are incredibly sensory atmospheres. And I wanted to, I guess this novel is not set in Calcutta. I mean, it's mostly set in Delhi and in the US, but the little bit of Calcutta there is, I wanted to capture a different Calcutta, not the Bengali or the middle class Calcutta, but the kind of a more, sort of working class city, this world of these bazaars. But it's all very sensory. I think I cannot write without the senses. I also like reading work which are sensory. I'm deeply drawn to reading, whether it's poetry or fiction that is sensory. And I'm also that kind of a writer myself. So yes.
That is what I wanted to ask you, because I could find a lot of parallels, especially on the sensory description between Gaskell's North and South and the Middle Finger, especially. Because North and South is about migration, about how the female protagonist with her family moves. And this is again about the faith. Her father is in conflict with the church, and Margaret moves with her entire family. And the first thing that she notices is the smells. The same is with Megha, from the smell of coffee to the smells of, different rather potpourri of smells that she experiences in Delhi. And the choice of curtains that she has to make in the markets that is full of noises and different kinds of smells. So I think I could see a lot of similarity between Gaskell's novels, Gaskell's North and South and the Middle Finger, especially about this transition period, the migration, the shift that is there, that somebody is forced out of circumstances. And the most important thing that I could find was the timing. The timing, the treatment of timing in your novels is amazing, because the moment the reader is comfortable, and I think this comes from how you treat the pace of the novel as well. The moment the reader feels comfortable, I think you like to shock your readers with something, completely different, because Megha gets this completely different opportunity to teach in India, in Delhi, when she is not really, when she's going through a tough time with completing a dissertation, she's looking for opportunities. It is sort of, you feel, okay, this person, I could actually feel her boredom in my own bones, applying to different places.
She's actually writing on medical humanities. She's writing a dissertation in medical humanities, and she's, I'm just...
because I could feel that you're writing for funding, writing different applications to different colleges, looking for opportunities. And I think this is what I could, sense, that amidst all that mundane, monotonous boredom, which is not so boring, it's full of activity, then comes a transition, a shift, which is what the readers don't expect at that time. But that's what it makes, interesting about the novel. So I was thinking about the timing when, the novel takes sort of a volta, a shift. So
yeah, no, I think change of place. I mean, I think again, speaking a bit about craft, I think in a sense, what I've noticed is, readers, or if you're viewing, a change of venue is always interesting, because in some ways it's not just a setting change, but it's a whole new set of relationships. How do you relate to the setting? How do you relate to, and here also it's different from my previous novels, because my previous novels were primarily rooted in one space, a very provincial local space and a child protagonist. But this one is a much more cosmopolitan, globe-trotting figure who moves from one country to another, and so we move along with her. But I think, place, and all of us who have moved in different places know this, that a place is such a character. It's like, even going back to canonical literature, like, Joyce's Dublin, or, these are not just a setting, they are kind of characters. And you are locked in a kind of a struggle with place. And with Megha's case, who was writing poetry about race while sitting in New Jersey and New York, and also dealing with the challenges and the guilt with it. The moment you move to a place like Delhi, everything changes, because suddenly she's no longer a brown person. In Delhi, you are not brown. You're kind of white, actually, because your color is again invisible, because you are privileged. And once you become privileged, you are living in a bubble. Um, she has a real poetic crisis, because her poetry came from this identity, this embattled identity, which she can't find. And if you remember, she starts writing much later again, when her relationship with Poonam has reached a kind of a crisis. That's when she regains a kind of a poetic voice. But I think this happens a lot with writers and intellectuals. Once we move to a new place, if we are artistic or thinking people, we form relationships with places. And the moment we move, it's not like it's an end of things. We might have a new relationship, but it's a challenge. And I think, for Megha, for me, this has been a reality. I mean, all the years I've lived in the US, I have written only about India, mostly. And the one novel where America plays a big role, I write while sitting in Delhi. So clearly, I mean, for me, in my case, I think memory is a very important choice. So I always say that I cannot write about a room while I'm sitting inside it. I just don't know what to write. The moment I step out, I can start writing, because memory is my editor. Memory tells me what is important. And memory tells you by often pointing out the most insignificant things. It's like all of us know this. You have a whole evening, whatever, you meet new people, or you go to a new place, and then you come back home, and then you remember like the weirdest things. You don't remember the subject of the conversation, but you remember how somebody moved their fingers, or you don't remember what you actually ate, but you remember one little thing that got stuck on your teeth. I mean, memory is so weird, right? Memory is so erratic. There's no telling the memory of, you look at somebody, you don't look at what they're wearing, but there's some coffee stain in the corner of their shirt that sort of, you just look at that. And I tell my students that, this is what makes characters memorable. Don't go on a whole biographical description, but look at that odd detail. And I know that memory helps me edit. Memory is like a dream also. Like, sometimes in a dream, you just, why did I dream that? I can see, I never thought that was important. And of course, there's a whole Freudian analysis, like, oh, what you actually dream is important. You just didn't think of it that way and all that. And I don't want to enter into that debate. But the fact is that when you're writing through memory, you have an editorial assistant, or rather you have an editor working with you. Your memory is your editor. Your memory is editing for you, and is in a strange way telling you this is what is worth writing about, and that is not worth writing about. And what I find most exciting is when memory gives me things which the world considers unimportant, and takes away things which the world considers important. And so often, it's like, that's why I like, writing as a child in some ways, because I think a child is haunted by primal terrors, joys, fears, experiences, but they can't intellectually make sense of it. And that gulf between experience and understanding is a powerful space of art. Now, with the middle finger, I didn't have that, because this is an adult protagonist, an intellectual, an artist who thinks about her experience. But even for that person, memory is always important, and in part of that is a memory of a lost home. She's always looking for a home, and part of the relationship is also about finding a home. But this is my suggestion to everybody in the room who wants to write, that memory is a very powerful tool that you have. And and because it's so eclectic, because it's so idiosyncratic, because it's so weirdly behaved, that's its whole beauty. I mean, if you take a photo, if you go on taking a video of an event, you will get a archive, but it doesn't do any editing. Let your mind be the video. Let your mind be the video. Let your mind, and you'll be amazed at the photos and the movies your mind replays for you. They are far more interesting than any video camera that can capture. And then you can write watching that video. That has always worked really well for me.
No, that is wonderful. No, I mean, I would totally agree with that. This is what I, tried doing with the Firebird, with this exercise as well. I would read your passages and then I would go back to my own memories. And this is what I did with the recent short story on vomit as well.
Yes.
I would go back to the memories and I would write. So I definitely agree. Memories play a great role when it comes to shaping the story, whether it's in the lyrical form, whether it's in the prose form. But, coming back to writing or creating characters, what struck me the most was how diverse, one writer can be when it comes to speaking, or rather, making a child speak certain sentences, or, letting the child do certain things that are extremely unexpected. Ori does completely, unexpected things for me. Ori is the, sort of a kiddo. I could have been, maybe if I would have been in his shoes. That's what I feel. You have this capacity to take the readers through their shoes, to the shoes of the characters, and make the readers feel exactly those points. I at no point felt that, the story could have gone otherwise, or the story could, I didn't for a moment feel that Ori could, as a child, should not take revenge, or Ori should have been more obedient, the stereotypical notion of a child. So I think the way the writers, for example, even in the middle finger as well, Megha does certain things, Poonam does certain things, makes decisions that do not strike as an anomaly. They seem very rational, that, it is very algorithmic. If this situation arises, a particular person in that situation would definitely take those decisions that the characters have taken. So how do you enliven those characters as a writer? What advice, suggestions would you give to the people present here for enlivening those characters in the kind of decisions they make, the kind of, psychological worlds that they themselves are unaware of and they explore? And, it's very intriguing as a reader to enter their psychological worlds and see and make sense of it and identify with them. So I was just wondering about that.
That's a great question. Thank you. I mean, and I'm really reassured to know that the characters have worked well, because the characters have worked, fiction has worked, because fiction is really character. Plot is secondary. I always tell people that, find the characters, find them in a certain space, and then let them do whatever they want to do. That whatever they do will be the plot. Plot comes secondary. And I also tell my students, creative writing students, that, when someone finishes a story, the reaction should always be like, oh my God, I didn't see that coming. But now that I think about it, it makes sense. There should be always this two-step reaction. So if they say, oh my God, where did they come from? It didn't make any sense. It's not the right reaction. Nor if they say, oh yeah, I could see that coming. That was neither of them. So they should be both surprised and it should make sense. That paradox of art, to be alien and familiar at the same time. Good art is whenever you find something alien and you find empathy in the same moment. That is what is important. We look for the familiar, we look characters we know from different, but at the same time we want something to be shocked. So if it's completely shocking, then it's not interesting to us. And if it's completely the same, then it's also not interesting to us. So I think characters are also like that. Obviously, with someone like Ori, I could start in my own experience, even because some of those experiences were mine. I knew, and then the story, even though I made up a story, so something I often do is I will take a character I know and put them in a new situation. I also tell this to my creative writing students: take a character you know. Writing what you know is always the best, but put them in a situation they haven't been. Now think how they might behave, because you know the character well, you know how they might. So, which is kind of what I did a little bit with the Firebird. It was a familiar character with familiar fears, and I think many of us start writing fiction with some versions of ourselves. We do have stories, we do have fears, but then fiction is, as I said, is about being myself but also not being myself, or sort of coming to terms with the alienness within myself. Like, how did I write about queer desire when I don't necessarily identify as queer, but then, what we identify as is only part of our identity. We can never say. But at the same time, it is true that when you grow up, when you go to certain kinds of schools, when you live in close proximity of roommates, you might have known a certain kind of a desire which may not have become part of your formative life as an adult, but you know that. So in a way, I think that's the beauty of an adult writing as a child. You you are not a child anymore, but you were a child once. So a child is the other that was once yourself. um, Obviously, when I'm writing as a woman, so in this middle finger, the big challenge was I was writing as a woman. I think it was, for me, it was important for me to focus on what I have in common with Megha. What are the spaces I know? And there's a lot of life experience I have in common with her. I mean, or at least I know people who have been through the spaces. So that is what I think you focus on. And then I think the most important suggestion I want to offer people who are writing about people who are different from you is that, remember, no character anywhere in life is a passive product of their background. Nobody is. They are shaped by their background, they are shaped by their race, sex, gender, class, whatever, but they're also unique. Now, I think the writer's job is to find how an individual is unique. And of course, that uniqueness is limited by the larger circumstances. You cannot really make a person do something that is, kind of hard to justify within their historical. You can't do that. But within that limitation, there's a lot of freedom. So focus on the uniqueness, because this is what the arts are interested in. The arts are interested in the ways in which individuals are unique. I mean, that's what I also say the difference between the social sciences and the arts. The social sciences are interested in group behavior. They're interested in larger patterns, or race, a nation, caste, gender, all of that. I think that whereas literature's interest is the unique. What is unique about this story? What is unique about that moment, that experience? The difference between history and fiction is not that one is made up and the other is true, because fiction can also be true. It's not that there are fictions which are completely true. But the difference is that fiction focuses on the private self. So you can write in a Tolstoy's War and Peace about the Napoleonic War, but the reader's interest is in not in what Napoleon did in Russia and all that, which one can get from history books, but how many times Napoleon brushed his teeth. What was the color of his underwear? I mean, all the kind of private details which are not there in the social sciences, are what the arts make interesting. That famous story that Demeter is saying that, oh, I'm going to talk about politics, nobody pays attention. He says, I'm going to tell you a story. And then everybody's like, oh my God, story. And my question is that people are interested in stories because they are interested in the particular. They are interested in a particular person. And I think when you're creating characters, you have to imagine that particularity. What makes that person unique? Sometimes I advise them that, see, stock characters are actually great, because the great thing about stock characters is, people know the basic traits. But for instance, one can think of Megha as, oh, the leftist poet academic, or Poonam as the devout church member, or Jishnu as the smart privileged student. But I always advise, take a stock character and then twist them. make them a little different. So you're actually getting the advantage of people identifying with their basic characteristic, but at the same time, so Megha might be a leftist poet academic, but who has serious misgivings about her artistic and intellectual performance, and who is looking for a home. So she has a stock characteristics, but she's also unique because she has certain quests of her own. Poonam might be a devout church member, but she's a church member who wants to create poetry in her sermon, who has a certain kind of a desire, who wants to learn to write in a certain way. Now that makes her unique. So I think the important thing to be is that, I mean, I personally I'm not one of those writers who write science fiction or speculative work very well. I mean, that's a different kind of skill. I greatly admire those writers. I'm not one of them, but I need reality. I think reality for me is the most thrilling, the most exciting, the most supernatural, and I think reality always has magic in it. And once I have a speck of reality, I can kind of let the speck run amok and create new realities. But I need to start with some familiar, known reality. And it doesn't have to be a full-fledged character, a moment. I mean, in some ways, this was how the Firebird started. I was telling, at the time I was teaching at Stanford, and I was telling a colleague, a drama theorist, that, I have this haunting memory of when I was 5. I remember I'm watching my mother and she was in the open air theater, and this terrible fear that she was dying, because she was dying. She was playing a role where she was dying, and she just heard me and said that, I think you have a novel there. And it was just a feeling. It was just like a one moment, and then I really got thinking about it, like, yeah, it's such a powerful fear. The failure to distinguish art from life is so powerful that you don't know. And that moment, and that story is completely made up, but that real moment is what I think. It's like that push you need. Once you get the push, once you get the voice, everything else will be fine, but you need something real to start.
It's amazing to see how each person, finds their own push, because sometimes it's also difficult that you have gotten the push, but you don't know that you have the push. So sometimes it's also, difficult as a writer to locate the voice, even if you have the push. But it's amazing to see how, you got the push and you wrote The Firebird, because it's the novel that's extremely close to my heart. Of all the works, that it's not that they are not great works, but The Firebird is extremely close because it helped me as well to find, the voice that I had been probably shutting down. I think the writer's fears are sometimes help them. So my fears have sometimes helped me to write critical works way better than creative works. When it comes to creativity, sometimes my fear has, sort of shut me down. But when it comes to writing critical works, my fear has helped me to write, with the deadlines especially, has helped me to work better with critical. So I was just thinking about studying the characters in the critical, in the critical arena, and creating creative characters, oscillation between the critical and the creative, being creative in the critical and being critical while you are creating. That's sort of a beautiful amalgamation that is sometimes missing in academia. Sometimes, you see the characters that are doing wonderful things in the novel, they're really dull. They appear as really flat faces. If I were to turn them into paintings, they would really not have eyes, ears, lips, anything. They seem flat, absolutely. And the same is true even in the academic writings as well. Sometimes they're so mundane, so boring. I mean, even if they are published in the most impactful journal, the point is that they don't really reach out. The article is not really speaking to you. So I was just thinking about how, both as a creative and a critical writer, you balance between the two.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I don't really believe in the difference. I think, I do believe in the difference between the scholar and the critic. I think the scholarly impulse is primarily oriented towards the archive, the archive is the most important. And I'm going to subordinate my own persona to the archive. Whereas a critic is actually more like a poet or a novelist. The critic is really talking about some book or film or whatever, but they're really talking about themselves. the book or the film is simply an exercise. It's kind of an excuse to talk about what I like, what I did. And there are, obviously when Wolf is reviewing a book or somebody, or it's like my own life basically. And it's a play between the self and the archive. I mean, how much of your own voice do you let come through? I mean, which is why we often tell academic writing a first person is a taboo and all those things. But actually, those kind of things have stunted us. It is true that when students come from high school, they're often too used to that personal voice, and getting them that academic voice is a bit of a challenge. But I think academia also pushes a little bit to the other extreme, where they completely stunt out the personal. And as I said, people, it's like listening to somebody talk. I mean, you want to hear, you want to know the person behind the person who's talking. You want to get a sense of the personality. And I think writing that stays with us the most is writing with a personality. You may be talking about an idea or something else, but that personality is what really lets you know. Unless of course you're looking for some information or something which is a different thing, then you have a very practical instrumental need for that, and that you're going to use it regardless. You don't really care about whether the writing is beautiful or not. That's a different thing. But if you're actually reading a piece of criticism to enjoy, or a non-fiction book where you don't have no particular interest in the theme, like if I'm to read a book on a sports I don't really understand, or a book on some aspects of medical research or technological research I have no idea, I will read it not because of the subject. I'll read it because of the personality of the narrator. And that I think is, I obviously I also write a lot of newspaper columns, and I found often beginning something with the first person, oh, I did this. People are interested. People are always interested in the particular. And also there is a sense of candor, that there is a confession, there is an admission. Of course, that's only one way. And in the same way, I think often novels can have criticism in them. Of course, the European novel of ideas was a very revered genre, whether it's Tolstoy or Victor Hugo, or Zola or Joyce. They've written novels of ideas where people discuss things. I'm not very much into that. I don't think I have long passages of discussion, but of course, Middle Finger has a lot of thoughts about poetry, has a lot of thought about politics. So in a sense, there is a critical consciousness in the novel too. And I don't think it's impossible to be human without thinking, just the way it's impossible to be human without feeling. We do make this artificial distinction between thinking and feeling, but in reality, imagination is the same. It is about thinking and feeling. We do live in a certain modern culture which is told that, oh, the abstract is better than the concrete, the mental is better than the physical, and that's the education we have. And of course, for the last 2 years we haven't had very much physical reality around us, so that has only impoverished us. But I think in many ways that's why poetry and its performance is so important, that you return to it in its bodiliness and you see that. So yeah, absolutely.
I would like to open the floor to the audience as well if they have any questions, because I have a long list and I can go on. But I mean, I would like the audience as well to participate if you have any questions.
May I ask a question? Yes. Thanks, Shrika, for a very fascinating conversation with Swati. I really enjoyed the talk, and then especially I liked the part when you were talking about the memories, which really motivated you and provide a lot of inspiration for your write-up. Actually, in cognitive science, there is a memory called autobiographical memory, which is distinguished from the episodic memory. So only after one has some higher order function like a language, the person can make sense of things and then reconstruct the one's own experience. And then they can at times find the value out of the what happened in the past. So because it seems like you really cherish the memory as your kind of source of your write-up. I'm wondering, how long it takes for you to digest your experience, which is stored as a memory, which can be somehow used or ready for your creative work. Does it take some time? You said, when you were in the United States, you didn't write about United States, but when you moved, to Delhi, you started writing about it. So I was just curious. Now this is your fourth book, so maybe you might have a better chance to use your recent memory for your next work. So whether there's some period for you to ferment the memory or something.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and thank you for pointing out the distinction. I haven't really studied memory in any scholarly way, so that's really useful to know that there is something called autobiographical memory, and that has its own rhythm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I think my second and third novels, The Firebird and The Scent of God. I mean, my first novel, I'm not very enthusiastic about. It really feels like a first novel. The second and third novel were both about phases and lives I've known as a child or an sort of a young adult. And I think one reason why I liked about that phase, as I just mentioned, is that it's a very vulnerable and powerful phase. I mean, we all know that there are some of the best novels from Dickens to contemporary writing is narrated by child protagonists, because child protagonist is such a fantastic narrator also. I mean, also because they're so unreliable, because they get so many things wrong. That's the beauty, and that's something I tell my students, that the most attractive narrator is sometimes the unreliable narrator, whether it's a child or a serial killer or somebody who just says bogus things. Because when you are entering a narrative universe, somebody is holding your hand and taking you in, and as you're being taken in, you realize this person is very unreliable. It's a very scary but wonderful feeling. You don't want to be led by somebody is always correct. So it's the beauty of the unreliable narrator. So I think I was drawn by that, but also the vulnerable period of childhood. As and again, my childhood had a lot of personal disturbances too, but that's a different thing. But so I was a bit surprised when this novel came to me, because it's obviously about realities I've known in a more recent past. And I was unsure that I could. I mean, for a while after having written Firebird and Scent of God, I thought, will I ever write with an adult protagonist? I mean, it's so risky. I mean, can one write adult conversation without sounding really predictable and boring and cliched and things like that? Because in my adult life, I do a lot of very conscious thinking. It's much easier to kind of drop that and become something else. But it's surprising. I mean, there are certain spaces of Delhi, certain spaces of New Jersey. Spaces are very important. The way they enter your head, the way they, shape you, it's very hard to tell. So I don't know. I mean, I think it depends on, you know, what part of your life affects you is very hard to tell. You may not realize that it's affecting you at the moment. You may realize it a year later, 2 years later, 3 years later, but you might. It is true, the formative years are really unique. I mean, till probably you're 18 or so, those years have a kind of a power which may not ever come back. And that they are definitely very powerful, because for many reasons. And I think cognitive science would obviously have an explanation for that as well. But that doesn't mean experiences stop at that, obviously. Clearly, people have very fundamental experiences. And I think, this is the beauty of art. Art uh, often comes from a sense of vulnerability, a sense of fear. I mean, the worst times of your life might be, in hindsight, the artistically most rich, the intellectually most full of possibilities. The time when you feel you're in control of your life actually may be less interesting. But it's hard to say. You can't. You just, all I can tell you is that you just know when you have a story. I have had many false starts when I tried to write something with an idea. It didn't go anywhere after 80, 100 pages. I threw it out. But when it just holds you, kind of like a demon that claims to be told. And you just know, and when it comes, sometimes it's not just yours. You hear somebody else's story and it just moves you so much. And you feel like, oh, what if I? And I think as you grow as a writer, go from just telling your stories to trying to tell other people's stories if they're really moving. And that's a real challenge because you have to become someone else. And to a degree, I've tried to become someone else in this novel. So thank you.
Fascinating. Thank you so much.
Okay, can I go for the question?
Yes, please.
So I just wanted to know, does writing come to you or do you seek writing?
That's a very difficult question. I think it primarily has to come to you. It primarily has to come to you because if it doesn't come to you, the original moment of inspiration has to come to you. But once you start writing, there's a lot of conscious planning. So writers like to have this fridge magnet, write drunk, edit sober. So the first moment is kind of a madness, and then there is a lot of conscious planning. I think because I'm a novelist, I'm primarily a fiction writer, I think what is very important for me is to get a sense of the character and the voice. Like, I don't think the story is that important. Stories will come in place, but what is the tone? What is the tone in which the story is being told? Is it a sarcastic, angry, impulsive, funny, or a mix of all of these? What is it? Once I know the tone and once I know the character, then it flows. But that being said, of course, once you have written a few books and you have read and criticized and sort of the world knows you as a writer, then it is true that you sometimes fall under the pressure that, oh, I know, people know me as a novelist, I must produce a novel every couple of years. I think that is the hard thing to avoid. I mean, but one must avoid it. You must write only when you have something to say. And there are a lot of wonderful writers who write just one book and then don't write anything, or they might write a book 15 years later. I think that's what we need to do. We don't need to fall into this. That's my problem of the professionalization of writing. That if you professionalize writing, then I don't think something kind of writing can ever be professionalized. There's always something eclectic and unpredictable about it. I mean, of course, I'm not talking about making a living from writing. That is a different thing. That for that you have to do many different kinds of writing. But I think if you become like a hack, then I don't think your writing will have the same quality, right?
I have a question for you, Saikat. I mean, I have been following your works for many years now. You're writing on the newspapers, and I've been reading your book now, Middle Finger. How important is a muse for you? Is it important for all authors to have a muse in mind while writing a romantic story or a romantic novel? I, for one, find it very helpful because I can take myself to that moment and then write about it. How do you find it, in your writing?
The muse is a very Greek idea. I think it's a fantastic idea. It's a really seductive idea. I mean, of course, the sexism of the idea is sometimes troubling. It's always a male writer with a female muse, and often the male writer is impregnating. There are all kinds of interesting tropes, medical humanities tropes as well. So I think it's interesting. The more I think about it, sometimes I'm troubled how even the relationship between Kalidas and Saraswati in Indian culture, how Saraswati herself does not create, but is the inspiration to often male writers. So I think there is the idea of the muse is, I think, belongs to a certain classical world of ornamental aesthetics, which has produced some beautiful literature. But I think it's politically a little limiting in today's world. And for romances, I have realized I'm very drawn to writing transgressive romances. I doubt if I'll write a love story of a happily married couple or something. I mean, of course, if I do, I'm sure there'll be something weird about them that I will write. But I thought, I mean, even in the Firebird, that whole attraction of the boy kind of this incestuous love for his mother. I mean, of course, he's possessive about his mother being on stage, or his incestuous attraction to his cousin. Scent of God, again, the two boys. I think here again, the sort of the intimacy between the teacher and the student, and the sort of the limits of that. So I think I'm always drawn to things which are a bit dangerous, which are full of dissent, and things which are often not enactable in real life. I mean, which is why I think with the Scent of God, it was read widely by queer readers and activists. You know, a lot of people really liked it, but some queer activists said that, oh, it's too quiet. There is not enough direct assertion of queer rights in this novel. I'm like, I don't know. The realm of art and the realm of activism don't always come together. But I think what you're saying, I completely hear you, Dia, that there is a kind of an inspiration necessity. But I am drawn to romances which have the mark on dissent on them, for better or for worse.
Thank you.
May I?
Sharmita.
Yes, Saikat, obviously, I mean, one of the things about your novels, and I haven't read the recent one, but I've read all your previous works, is like, your writing has become like literally bolder from starting from your very first novel to when you went to the second one. Yes, there was this incestuous kind of attraction for the cousin and for the mother, but, it was still in the realm of theater. And at least for me, theater took, and coming from Calcutta with, growing up with a lot of theater, basically myself. So it was like theater still took the very center stage. And it was as a child who has like, who was the attraction to the motherly figure. And then of course, the Scent of God, and where you had this monastic setting. And that was a huge, I mean, on one hand, there was a huge appreciation. On the other hand, I mean, a lot of people identified a certain institution, right, which is almost revered, right? Yeah. Both in terms of academics and in terms of, real life values, right? So you took, it almost like you took that on. And now as a teacher in India, as a professor, you are talking about a myth in a current setting, which is a teacher-student relationship, right? So yeah. How has your own experience, your own transnational experience, right? When you started, possibly you were in Stanford, and then you moved back to India of today, right? And how has that impacted this, this being so bold and, touching on themes which somebody might say are difficult and, dangerous, if I may say, quote unquote.
Absolutely. Thank you for that really wonderful reading of all my novels, and thank you for reading them. I'm really moved by that. I think we are living in an increasingly dangerous world. I think we all agree that, everything around us is so unstable, so incendiary. I mean, I left the US the year Trump became president, and I came to India ruled by Modi, and then, it was like, I remember one crazy week where Trump became president, demonetization happened, the terrible pollution in Delhi, and Leonard Cohen died, all within a space of a week. So it was like insane. I wrote an essay about that week. So it was just intense. And I think in any writer, almost, I feel in many ways you can't not respond to the nature of the times. I'm not a very topical writer. I don't write about issues. I'm not drawn to books which talk about issues. And yet we are touched by issues in very unconscious ways. Even if Scent of God captured reality in the school, in this very real school Sharmita is talking about in the late 80s or early 90s, I think it came out in 2019, and the conversations about both homosexuality and Hindutva that were happening clearly shaped it in some ways. And obviously it ended up coming shortly after the decriminalization of homosexuality. So there was a lot of discussion around that book. And of course, the Me Too scandal is something, all of us who teach, we've sort of lived, it has been so around. And I've been very jolted by it because so many people have known very closely, trusted, and I've actually loved them, have been accused. And this goes back to my teaching at Stanford, where there's so many people I know, to Jadavpur, my alma mater. It's just been a real jolt. And it's also been a real jolt talking to my sort of my women friends, my classmates, and hearing things like, "Oh, guys, you didn't know he was like that. We always knew." I'm like, I had no idea. What are you talking about? I'm like, of course you wouldn't know because, and this, I was just so, I mean, this whole thing, I think when you grow up as a guy, I think there are certain things like even walking in an Indian city, you don't think of it as a threatening activity, right? But if you talk to women who've grown up, I'm like, your entire perspective changes that, oh my God, this is what it's like. So I think this was happening to me for a while, that what does it mean to live in academia, and even now, right now, the whole, the South Africa Komarov scandal is now exploding there.
Even the Harvard scandal, right? I mean,
The Harvard scandal is going on. And yet at the same time, there is that deep sort of link, almost a kind of an erotic connection of learning, and erotic not in a sexual way, that when you excite somebody with learning, when you excite somebody, so it's a very contentious subject. There was a time in the 60s and 70s, a lot of feminist critics asserted this is a kind of a liberty that and at the fluid sexuality. A lot of queer people, people like Jane Gallup, they asserted it. So I think this whole idea, what is the limit of intimacy, the sheer power, and those of you who are doing PhDs, obviously know the power a PhD advisor can have, and advisors have much more power over the graduate students than the undergraduates, because undergraduates will go for different careers. And what are the codes? And this is something I've thought about ever since I started teaching. I mean, I finished my PhD quite early, and I started teaching, and I had PhD students who are older than me. And so I was very friendly with them. I was hanging out and things like, and it was fine. And at the same time, I realized that, I'm serving on their committees, I'm doing this, and yet I'm their friend. And it was fine. I think in North America, it's a very non-hierarchical culture. When I moved to Stanford, my first job was in Canada. When I moved to Stanford, it was a more hierarchical culture. In India, of course, I think this generation of students are much more vocal than what we were, but there's still a kind of an old-fashioned respect for the teacher, which is wonderful. I mean, they never call me, I always tell my students to call me Saikat, and almost no one does, because that's how. So I have been thinking about all these issues for a long time. And that's why the Dronacharya. So in a sense, I think, Sharmita, you're exactly right. I have been drawn towards some of the most incendiary subjects of our time, but I never thought like that. I always thought that these are issues that have been with me all my life. I didn't want to write a novel about homosexuality after 2018. This was the story of an experience of a life I've known 20 years ago. I didn't want to write about a teacher-student romance story after the Me Too scandal. This is something I've been thinking about ever since I entered university. These are in a way classic themes, but at the same time, you're right. There is a lot of debate, a lot of controversy around them, and you're absolutely right. They are becoming increasingly sensitive. So I don't know where I'm headed next.
Thank you so much. I'm very sure you're headed to even more literary accolades, definitely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I think we should be a little bit mindful of the time as well, considering that we have, created more fatigue to Saikat, who's recovering from COVID. So.
Yeah, no, I've been very rejuvenated by this conversation, so all good. But thank you. These are great questions. So I'm really glad for the reading and the questions.
Thanks a lot, Saikat. I really feel that we have all, learned so much, and this exchange, osmosis of ideas, most importantly, I never felt for a moment, through the entire event, that these were question answers. It was more like osmosis of, ideas, the exchange that has enriched the experience for all of us, I think we're going to all go back to our writing and reflect, okay, what are my characters speaking now?
I always learn more about my characters when I talk to you, Swati, so that's not a surprise for me at all. So
it's an honor, to be honest. But yeah, I mean, I'd like Juyung to close the session, and thanks a lot, Saikat.
Yeah, on behalf of all the writing studio crew and then IIT Gandhinagar, we really, want to deliver heartfelt thank you for Saikat, Professor Majumdar, for being here and then sharing your thoughts and giving us a lot of a very inspiring talk of not only about your characters and novels, but about your views, perspectives, and your routines and your life as a writer. So it was very inspiring talk. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. And then for other audience, and then especially our special moderator, Ms. Swati Joshi, I really appreciate your great work. Thank you everyone. Thank you very much. And there will be another writers at work coming up in the next month, so please stay tuned. And then perhaps like our coordinator, Professor Lazar, would like to say something.
No, there's nothing more to say. Thank you very much, Saikat. We really enjoyed this interaction. Thank you, Swati. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you for having me. This is a wonderful series that you have, and I hope I was able to get you thinking about writing in a small way. It's a fun process, but it's a very bewildering process. I hope I brought out the sort of the fun as well as the fear. So it's for you to choose. And feel free to reach out to me. I'm on there on email, on social media. I'm happy to talk to any of you. And again, thanks to all of you. Thanks to Swati for all your wonderful questions. So,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you, everyone. Bye.